I'm really loud. Yeah, it's full. We're about to be live. We're live now. No worries. You guys can play in the background the whole time I'm up here. Like, it'll be good. I always find that, like, you know, when I'm... Yeah. Or, like, I always really like when a speaker is, like, talking and they have some kind of music behind. Like, you always know that the pastor's about to hit a really deep point when the worship leader gets up onto the piano and is like... And you hear, like, the thing going on in the background and you're like, this is it. This is when it hits.
Okay, so when you're going to do an altar call, we need to break out in Highway to Hell.
Yes.
A lighter version, of course. But
Right. Well, and we'll switch it. We'll be like, we'll sing "Stairway to Heaven." There you go.
I get you. No, go this way, go that way.
Right. Awesome. Where did Bethany go? Is she, Nolan, will you check and see? There she is. Good. Well, good morning, everybody, the worship team that's here and everybody joining us through live stream. We want to welcome you this morning to Sunday School. Our new and fantastic children's director, who's getting introduced officially this morning. Yeah, she has something that she would like to come and share with us. So I'm going to give you, Nolan, I'm just going to give her this mic so that way she can talk and be heard by everybody online. Talk and be heard. I'm going to give you this. Yeah, so you do what you got to do.
All right, so good morning. My name is Bethany Tibbs, and I am the children's director here at First Church of the Nazarene. And in stepping into this role, Pastor Olmert challenged myself and our team to come up with a plan for children's ministry. And one of the components is something that's very near and dear to my heart. We're calling it a prayer partnership. And what we're asking is for the adult Sunday school classes to partner with 4 or 5 children in our children's ministry and commit to praying for them daily. We also are asking that once a month you reach out to the kids, let them know, hey, I'm praying for you, I'm thinking about you. Once a quarter, interacting with the kids through virtually or face-to-face, just depending on your preference, and then recognize them at Christmas and on their birthday. We really want to build a connection between our children's department and adult Sunday school classes. So if you're interested, let me know. Our goal is October 25th to introduce the children to you. Any questions? Well, thank you so much, and I look forward to hearing back from you guys.
Alrighty. Well, thank you for giving me just a couple of seconds. Awesome. Collecting my train of thought again. Cool. Sunday school, we're here. I've got my notes. Everything's good. All right. Well, so we started into a new series last week for Sunday school. We're going through some word studies. We're looking at theologically significant words in the scriptures, hopefully to help us gain a better grasp of what the entire story of the Bible is about. We looked last week at the word for hear, the word Shema, which is a great word. I love that word. This week, I don't have my whiteboard, which is unfortunate. I would love to have my whiteboard this week. Because this week we're going to talk about one of probably like the big earmark words that people hear, and sometimes this word is like a trigger word for some people. Because it's a big word, it's a huge word, and so the word we're going to talk about today is the word sin. And so I want you to be thinking in your mind, what is sin? How is it biblically defined? And we're going to take a look at not just one word today, but we're going to look at 3 different words for sin, how it's typically used. So Bob, if you would, go ahead and play us our video.
Most people assume the Bible has what humans are, and that's true. It's so true that the vocabulary about this topic sounds odd. Using words like sin, iniquity, or transgression. And so the Bible's perspective on the human condition is often ignored or treated as ancient and backwards. This is really unfortunate, because through these words, the biblical authors are offering us. Most people assume the Bible has a lot to say about how messed up humans are, and that's true. It's also true that the Bible's vocabulary about this topic sounds odd to modern people, using words like sin, iniquity, or transgression. And so the Bible's perspective on the human condition is often ignored or treated as ancient and backwards. This is really unfortunate, because through these words, the biblical authors are offering us a deeply profound diagnosis of human nature. Iniquity describes behavior that's crooked, while transgression refers to breaking trust. And sin, this is actually the most common of these bad words in the Bible, so let's focus on it for a few minutes. Sin translates the Hebrew word chata and the Greek word hamartia. The most basic meaning of sin isn't religious at all. Chata simply means to fail or miss the goal. Like when the Israelite tribe of Benjamin trained a small army of slingshot experts, they could sling a stone at a hare and not chata, that is, fail or miss. Or there's a biblical proverb that warns against making hasty decisions because you're likely to chata your way, miss your destination. So in the Bible, sin is a failure to fulfill a goal. But what's the goal? Well, on page 1 of the Bible, we learn that every human is an image of God, a sacred being who represents the Creator and is worthy of respect. And so in this way of seeing the world, sin is a failure to love God and others by not treating them with the honor they deserve. You can see this idea in the famous code of conduct given to the Israelites, the 10 Commandments. Half of them identify ways you can fail at loving God, and the other half name ways you can fail at loving people. And the fact that both kinds of failure are combined shows that failing to honor God is deeply connected to failing to honor people. This is why in the Bible, sin against people is sin against God. Like when Joseph refuses to sleep with the wife of Potiphar, he says, "How could I sin against God?" In Joseph's mind, failing to honor a human made in God's image is a failure to love God. And so, sin is a failure to be truly human. But there's more. A fascinating thing about sin in the Bible is that most of the time that people are failing, they either don't know it, or even worse, they think they're succeeding. Like when Pharaoh wants to build Egypt's economy and protect national security, in his mind, this justifies enslaving the Israelites. He thinks it's good, and he's totally unaware that it's an epic fail. Or when King Saul is chasing David around the wilderness trying to kill him, he thought he was bringing a criminal to justice until he realizes he's the corrupt one. And he says, "I have sinned. I am the failure." So sin is about more than just doing bad things. It describes how we easily deceive ourselves and spin illusions to redefine our bad decisions as good ones. So why are humans such bad judges between moral failure and success? Well, the first appearance of the word sin in the Bible offers an insight. There are these 2 brothers, Cain and Abel. Their parents had just given in to this beastly temptation to redefine good and evil by their own wisdom, and now Cain is faced with a similar choice. He's jealous and angry that God has favored his brother, and so God warns him, if you don't choose what is good, chata is crouching at the door, it wants you. But you can rule over it. So in these stories, sin, or moral failure, is depicted as this wild, hungry animal that wants to consume humans. And we know how that story ends. The Bible is trying to tell us that failed human behavior, our tendency towards self-deception, it runs deep. It's rooted in our desires and selfish urges that compel us to act for our own benefit at the expense of others. And it leads to this chain reaction of relational breakdown. This is why in the New Testament, the Apostle Paul describes hamartia as a power or a force that rules humans. In his words, we are slaves to sin. He even says sin lives in us, so that the things I don't want to do, that's what I do. So with the word sin, the biblical authors are offering a robust description of the human condition. It's a failure to be humans who fully love God and others. It's our inability to judge whether we're succeeding or failing, and it's that deep, selfish impulse that drives much of our behavior. This is not a pretty picture of ourselves, but if we're honest, it's realistic. This is why in the Bible, the story of Jesus is such good news. He's depicted as the Creator become a truly human one who did not fail to love God and others. That is, he did not sin. And yet, he took responsibility for humanity's history of failure. He lived for others, and he died for their sins. And he was raised from the dead to offer them the gift of his life that covers for their failures. Or in the words of the apostles, he committed no sin, yet he carried our sins in his body on the cross, so that we might die to our sins and live to do what is right. And that's the story behind the biblical word for sin. Hey, everyone.
All right, so very uplifting topic this morning, talking about sin. I think that it's important for us to really get in our heads and in our minds as we think about the story of the Bible, though, because clearly the Bible is trying to diagnose, is trying to say, here's what has gone wrong, here's what's gone amiss with humanity. And generally, this is what all religions are trying to do. They're trying to say, what is the human condition? What is the thing that makes us not act like we think we should? The biblical word for that is sin. And as the video talked about a little bit, there are actually 3 different words that we generally use for this biblical problem of sin or of evil, if you will, specifically ones that are done by humans. You have the word sin, which we're going to spend quite a bit of time on. But there's also 2 more, and each one of these gets their own different video on the Bible Project page, which you're encouraged to watch. But we're going to just touch on them briefly. But the other 2 words are iniquity and transgression. A lot of times we have a tendency to meld all 3 of these words together, where iniquity and transgression are sin, and they're all kind of the same envelope of stuff, and it's just kind of delivered to us, and we don't really delineate between what is the difference between one and the other. But I think it's really important for us to get a really robust idea of what the human condition is, what's actually going on inside each and every one of us. Because the Bible paints this really cool, I say cool ironically there, but it paints this really cool picture of here is the human failing, in a nutshell. The most common word that's used is sin. It's chata, it's hamartia, which again we're going to look at in depth. But there's more aspects to it than that. It's not just sinning, it's not just missing the mark, but it's also iniquity, it's also transgression. And you have these different lenses that you look at it through. And so where one thing might not necessarily be sin, it ends up being more of iniquity or more transgression. And so we start to get this really big, robust idea of this is what's wrong. And then as you start to move into, the Old Testament and New Testament story, you start to see how God's actions reverse those things that are wrong. And it becomes this big, beautiful story of God, curing and fixing the human condition as was set out. So let's look at this first big word, this word sin. The Hebrew word is chata. It's one of those ones you got to get way in the back of your throat, chata. Or the Greek word is hamartia, which if you've done any sort of theological study before, the study of sin is called hamartiology, taken directly from the Greek word there. And the word sin literally just means to fail or to miss the goal, right? And so the couple of examples that they gave us in the video, and we're going to look at these because it's always good to check your Bible, as we talked about last week. So a couple of really good examples. Judges chapter 20, verse 16. So again, this is talking about the tribe of Benjamin. They're training themselves to get ready for battle. Yeah, Judges chapter 20, verse 16. And it says of this tribe of Benjamin, it says, of all this force, there were 700 picked men who were left-handed, and everyone could sling a stone at a hair and not miss. So these guys are super accurate with, I don't know if you've ever used a sling before, but like they're crazy. And the fact that these guys are able to do that and not miss, like I'm astounded. But the word not miss there is chata. So they're able to sling a stone at a hair and not chata. So again, they would not fail. They would not miss the goal. Like if the goal is a hair on somebody's head, they could sling the stone and it would hit the hair and nothing else. Which again, pretty impressive. Or another really good example, and one that I really like, is Proverbs 19:2. I'm in Psalms and I'm going backwards. That's not right. So Proverbs 19:2, which talks about one who is walking on a path. We'll start at 19:1. Better the poor walking in integrity than one perverse of speech who is a fool. Yeah. Desire without knowledge is not good, and one moves too hurriedly misses the way. And so again, you have this idea from the wisdom teacher that walking in integrity is better than walking in perverse speech. Desire without knowledge is not good, and one who moves too quickly chatas. One who moves too quickly misses. They fail to reach their intended goal because they have no knowledge, right? They don't know where they're going. And so this idea of sin, it's this big, sprawled out, outstretched idea. Maybe as you've been in church settings, you've heard like this term actually gets carried into medieval times as well, and it becomes an archery term, where if you're an archer and you're shooting at a target, the like amount that you miss the center by is called sin. Like it's just how much you miss the goal by. It's carries the exact same connotation, right? You've sinned, you've missed the mark, if you will. But so the question with all of this, the biblical story included, has to be now, well, what is the goal then? If sin is failing to meet the goal, then what is the goal? And we're going to rewind this all the way back to Genesis chapter 1, because Genesis chapter 1 is incredibly important. It will always be important. But Genesis chapter 1, verse 26, it says this. It says, "Then God said, 'Let us make humankind in our image, according to our likeness, and let them have dominion over the fish of the sea, and over the birds of the air, and over the cattle, and over all the wild animals of the earth, and over every creeping thing that creeps upon the earth.' So God created humankind in his image. In the image of God, he created them, male and female, he created them." And so you have this, humans are originally intended, they are originally built to be the image of God, to rule on this earth basically as God's proxy. The Hebrew word for image there is the word tselem, which has it's a TS sound, it's a tselem. But a tselem is basically what ancient kings would use. It was like a statue of an ancient king that they would set up in a province that was really far away from where they actually lived. And it was meant to say, like, this is the king who rules here. That was their image. And so people who lived in that country would be like, who's our king? Oh, well, we have this image of this is who our king, this is who rules here, and ultimately this is the one who's responsible for things that go on here. And so God, when he creates everything, puts humankind here as his tselem, as his image. And so it's no wonder then when you start to get into the commandments, God says, do not make for yourself an image, or do not make an image of me, because there's already an image of God. It's all of us. We don't need to make another image because there is already one. But even more than that, this gives us the goal of humanity. The whole point of what we're trying to do is basically to honor God, to honor people, to rule things in God's stead. And so when we fail to honor people, or when we fail to honor God, we've missed the whole point of why we were created. And so that is what sin is, right? We've missed the mark of that. And there's a slight shift in thinking that I think is really important here, especially in a Western church mindset, because maybe you've heard, out in your travels and in your studies before that, oh, we all sin. Like, it's just being human, right? To be human is to sin. To be human is to err, maybe. But the Bible actually takes that and flips it on its head and says, no. To be truly human is to not sin. To be truly human is to perfectly honor God and to perfectly honor people. And so maybe when we sin, what we're actually saying is that, we're failing to be fully human, not in some kind of derogatory, like, oh, I'm not even human way, but it's like we're all falling short of this grand, glorious goal that has been set before us. It's not a part of our DNA. It's not a part of, that's not the way we were initially intended to be. And so when I sin, it's not because I was just going to do that, but it's because I'm failing to actually meet the goal that I was set out for. A great example of this is Genesis 37, where Joseph, one of the patriarchs, Joseph, has been taken into this Egyptian's house. He's serving this guy's house. His name's Potiphar. He's serving at this guy's house, and this guy's wife is doing everything in her power to sleep with Joseph, and Joseph is like, no, I can't do that. And so in Genesis 37:9, is it 37? Oh, no, that's not right. It's not 37. 37:9 says Joseph had another dream, and it was told to him. Joseph is not having dreams at that point. Is it 39? 39:9? Thank you, Mia. Yeah, so 39:9. Joseph, again, he's talking to Potiphar's wife here. We'll start back at like the second half of verse 6. It says, now Joseph was handsome and good looking, and after a time his master's wife cast her eyes on Joseph and said, lie with me. But he refused and said to his master's wife, look with me here. My master has no concern about anything in the house, and he has put everything he has in my hand. He is not greater in this house than I am, nor has he kept back anything from me except yourself, because you are his wife. How then could I do this great wickedness and sin against God? And so here Joseph has this idea of, if he were to fail in honoring his master, if he were to fail in honoring Potiphar, the master of this house, he would actually fail in honoring God as well. And so Joseph seems to have this robust idea of like, if I sin, if I fall short, it's really a failing of, just completely and totally missing the goal of what I was created to do in the first place by not honoring this human and by sleeping with his wife, which I know I'm not supposed to do. And so we have this robust picture of missing the mark and of sinning. But sin actually starts to take on a secondary mindset or a secondary motive, because sin really starts to become an active force, right? It's not just something that, I either do or I not do. It's not some abstract theological category, but it becomes something that God's people become aware of from very early on, and it starts to take on sort of a life of its own. So let's look at Genesis chapter 4. Genesis chapter 4, verse 7. So Genesis chapter 4, Adam and Eve, right, created in the garden, they ultimately fail to honor God by saying, we're going to take from the tree of the knowledge of good and bad, we're going to define what's right and what's wrong for ourselves. And God says, all right, you can do that, but you can't live here in the garden anymore unless you live forever, and, things go really poorly for you. So they end up outside of the garden, they end up having kids, and you have two brothers, Cain and Abel, right? They both go, they offer sacrifices to God, and God favors Abel's offering more than Cain's. Why? We don't know. He just does. God does what he does sometimes, and it's on him. But this makes Cain really angry. He's like, why do you not accept my offering as much as my brothers? And so Genesis 4, verse 6, the Lord said to Cain, why are you angry, and why has your countenance fallen? If you do well, will you not be accepted? And if you do not do well, sin is lurking at the door, and its desire is for you, but you must master it. And so sin, again, from very early on, takes on this connotation of it's this crouching lion, right? It's lurking to seek and destroy. It's looking to devour those. Maybe you're starting to get a picture of another spiritual being who is named after these certain things. Satan and sin actually have a tendency to be conflated in this way, but it doesn't happen for a while. And so as you're reading through the Bible, you have the serpent in the garden, who is the wisest of all creatures, never actually called evil, only ever called wise. He's wise. He goes and he makes a good argument to the people. Christians have interpreted this as ultimately deceiving them, which, you know, we see later on in like New Testament scriptures and stuff. But the serpent is wise. He gives them a choice. They take the choice. They get kicked out of the garden. But then you have this sin thing that is not connected with the serpent at all yet. And the sin thing is, according to God's words, is lurking at the door. It's crouched. It's waiting. It's like this wild beast, right, that is sitting there and is waiting for the human. And if the human does not do well, then its desire is for them. It's going to devour them. It's going to take them over. But the human, much like the rest of the wild beasts of the earth, the human can master it. The human can become the master of sin and can sin no more. And so these ideas are taken, and slowly but surely, again, this idea of Satan, this idea of evil and sin, they start to overlap. They start to be conflated to where now I think we have a really hard time differentiating between, you know, this is what Satan, this is what evil is, and this is what sin is. Maybe to help us get a good look at that, let's turn all the way now to the book of Romans. So several thousand years have passed. Big grand story of the Bible has been going on, and Paul here is writing his letter to the Romans. And in Romans chapter 6, verse 6, Paul is talking here, he's talking about sin, really. And so in chapter 6, verse 6, Paul says this. He says, "We know that our old self was crucified with him," being Jesus, "so that the body of sin might be destroyed, and we might no longer be enslaved to sin. For whomever has died is free from sin." And so we get this picture, right, of Paul, who is talking about sin actually like living inside of us. It's this beast that was crouching at the door, but now even beyond just crouching at the door, it has like taken root inside of human beings and is just waiting for its next opportunity to rear its ugly head. But Paul talks about literally like if you are crucified with Christ, if you have taken on this lifestyle of following after Jesus Christ, if you are participating in his death, his crucifixion, his burial, and his resurrection, then the body of sin might be destroyed. And so one of Paul's big theological points here is that Jesus in the crucifixion took on all sin to himself, and that sin that was embodied, that was in the body, was actually destroyed on the cross. And so death and evil were done away with on the cross, so that we might no longer be enslaved to sin, so that this beast that's lurking at the door, that is like living inside of each one of us, no longer has any power over us. And so this is a huge, big transformation thing, right? It's saying that not only can we master sin, but now we don't even have to live with sin. Like we can live without sin, following Wesley's thought of entire sanctification there. Turning just a little bit later, even to Romans chapter 7, verse 17, again, Paul continuing to talk about sin. Going back one to verse 16, he says, "Now if I do what I do not want, I agree that the law is good." So Paul is talking about the law here. And he says, "But in fact, it is no longer that I do it, but sin that dwells in me." So Paul here again, he's given us the remedy. He said, if you have died, if you've gone through the crucifixion thing, if you've given your life over to Jesus, if you've participated in that death, burial, and resurrection of Jesus, then sin has no more power in you. But we know that there's still this struggle, right? This internal struggle. Sin is there. It's lurking at the door and it's waiting for us. Depending on who you ask, we might not ever be done with sin until Christ returns fully. But so this picture of sin that I'm really wanting to get across to you here this morning is that sin it's this beast, this wild animal that lurks at the door and it waits. And again, it goes so far as even to live inside of each one of us and just waits for its opportunity. It crouches at the door like a hungry lion, waiting for whom it will devour. I need to check my time. Beautiful. Thank you. Cool. So that's sin in a nutshell, right? It's missing the goal. It's failing really to live up to be fully human, but it ends up taking on a life of its own where it's not just a measure by how much you have missed, but instead it becomes this wild beast that like encourages you and pulls you off to be something different than what you were truly created to be. And one of the things that the video talked about that I didn't get a ton into is that a lot of times sin for a lot of people looks like them thinking that they're doing the right thing. And so you have a lot of talks, especially in the wisdom literature, about pride. You know, pride is being like, I know what I'm doing, I know what's going on, I've got this, like everything's going okay. And the scriptures are very clear, and it says God opposes the proud, he befriends the humble. So it's this whole idea of pride, like, you know, it's always good to take a humble stance. Like, have confidence in yourself, know that you're doing well, you're doing good, but always be ready to take correction, always be ready to say, you know, I can always do maybe just a little bit better, I can turn just a little bit that way. Because again, sin it's constantly inviting us to live a less than human life. But so then, what do we do with these other two words, right? Because we've kind of given this big broad heading of sin, but there are two other words generally that we associate with sin or with evil, and these words are iniquity and transgression. And so we start to say, you know, okay, well, I don't even know what I'm going to do with these two words, right? Sin seems to be like the big problem. And these words are definitely all interconnected, and, you know, to transgress something or to transgress someone really is, in my mind, it is to sin. Like, sin is kind of the big umbrella, and you have all of these other little things that are under it. But let's take a look at these really quickly, just to help us get a more robust view of the human problem. So the word transgression, the Hebrew word that's translated here is the word pesha, which is kind of a fun word. The Greek word, I need to make sure I say this right, is paraptoma, which is another really fun word to say. It's got the letter pi in there, which I think is really cool. I really like the letter pi. But pesha, transgression, is literally, the best way to say it, is violating the trust of others. And so this in a sense is sin, like it's failing to be truly human, because being truly human is living in community with each other. When God created Adam, he said it's not good for Adam to be alone, and so he gives him somebody else and is like, guess what? You're going to live in community now for the rest of forever, because that's what humans do. And so pesha, this transgression, it's violating the trust of others. And one important thing to get with this idea of transgression is that transgression is never really like against somebody, but it's always with, especially in the Hebrew mindset. So when you transgress with someone. So an example of this is 2 Kings chapter 1, verse 1, which you don't necessarily have to turn there. This one is pretty easy, but if you want to check me, I'm okay with that. But 2 Kings chapter 1 and verse 1 talks about Moab. They pesha with Israel. So they have this big covenant, or this big treaty, which is kind of a covenant. They have a big treaty signed with each other. And yeah, after the death of the king Ahab, Moab, the NRSV translates it as rebelled against Israel, but it's literally they peshad. They broke the trust of Israel, or they violated the trust. The same word gets taken and gets reused, it gets retraditioned by the prophets. So specifically, the prophet Micah in Micah chapter 3, verse 8. I don't think I'm going to be able to find Micah that fast. I found it. Look at that. So Micah chapter 3, verse 8, Micah says this. He says, "But as for me, I am filled with power and with the Spirit of the Lord and with justice and might, to declare to Jacob his transgression and to Israel his sin." Right? And so here in Micah, you start to see that there's a separation, a little bit of these two things. Micah is declaring both transgression and sin. And so Micah is going to to Jacob, to these different tribes, and he's saying, I'm declaring to you that you have broken the trust of God by doing all of these different things. And the prophets go absolutely crazy with this idea, right? They constantly accuse God's people, they accuse Israel of, living in these horrible ways. Like, you're taking the poor and you're selling them for a pair of sandals, Amos talks about. Or, you have these kings that are living this big, high, and lofty life, and, they're constantly oppressing their people, and so they've broken the trust of their people, and they've broken the trust of God, whom has put them over these people in order to rule. And really, this is kind of like the story that the whole Bible is about, right? Humans were initially created, they were given a certain amount of trust, and humans constantly break that trust. We looked at it with the story of Abraham, where God is like, I'm going to swear by myself that I'm going to make this covenant, and that, if this covenant should ever be broken, I'm taking it upon myself, because God is like, I know that humans are not going to be trustworthy. And so I'm going to do that. I'm going to take all of that on. But Pesha is, again, this transgression idea is really breaking of trust. You see the same idea played out in Romans 5:15, where Paul is talking about Adam. And so Paul is giving this idea, and he says, sin came into the world by the paroptoma of a human, by one singular human, by the sin of Adam himself. And again, the word paroptoma is this transgression, this betrayal of trust, right? So the humans, they betrayed the trust of God. God put them in the garden and said, don't eat of this tree, and they went and ate of the tree. So they broke that trust. But here's a really cool thing. You start to get a picture in the New Testament of Jesus Christ, who, in addition to, taking on sin in the body and in dying for it, Jesus Christ also takes on the worst of our pesha. He takes on the worst of our transgressions, the worst of our betrayals. He takes it on, for us by literally taking it on. Judas, one of his 12 closest friends, betrays him and sells him. The community that Jesus was placed inside of takes him, flogs him, and then hangs him up to be crucified. And so he takes on that breaking of trust from his own community. But even more than that, Jesus responds to transgression by continuing to be trustworthy. And so Jesus continues to be trustworthy for us. And so you have this same idea, and this is characteristic of God throughout the whole entirety of Scriptures, that when humans are untrustworthy, God remains trustworthy. And so the idea of transgression there, again, is partially failing to miss the mark, but it's really more talking about a betrayal of trust that happens. And so there's a distinction that's made there. And then the last word that we get to is the word iniquity. This is a fun word because a lot of times, again, in my mind especially, I would always conflate iniquity and sin. It's like, he was bruised for our transgressions, he was wounded for our iniquities, right? We've heard that, and now we say, okay, I have a general idea of what transgression is, but what is iniquities? The Greek word, or not the Greek word, the Hebrew word for iniquity is avon. Another kind of fun word to say. It's related to the Hebrew noun the Hebrew word avah, and the word avah literally just means bent or crooked. And so if I was bent over in such a certain way and I couldn't move, they would say that my spine is avah, it's bent or it's crooked. So for example, in Job 33:27, you have Job saying that a person who morally fails, he avahs what is right, he bends, he makes crooked what is supposed to be right in his moral failings. Or in Isaiah 59:12 through 14, you have Isaiah actually taking this word avah and making sort of a play on words on it. And basically he says, we have so much avah, we have so much bentness, we have so much crookedness that uprightness can't even enter the city. And so it's this idea of it's bent and it's twisted and it's turned, right? A lot of times you have this idea of avon or avah being talked about in terms of not just moral actions and decisions, but you have it in terms of consequences as well. So when somebody does something, the actions for that or the consequences of that are avon. They're bent or they're crooked. And so you have in Exodus 34:6 and 7, Yahweh, Yahweh, a God merciful and Great, gracious, I always do. I do this every time I try and say this verse, and at some point I'm going to get it right. But it's gracious and merciful, slow to anger, and abounding in steadfast love and faithfulness, but not clearing. I just need to go and read it. I'm stuck on mercious and grace. Gracious and merciful. I can't. I literally can't. I don't know why. Most quoted line in the Bible, and I can't even say it. Sometimes it happens. So here's what it says: the Lord, a God merciful and gracious, slow to anger and abounding in steadfast love and faithfulness, keeping steadfast love for the 1,000th generation, forgiving iniquity and transgression and sin, all three of those things. Yet by no means clearing the guilty, but visiting the iniquity of the parents upon the children and upon the children's children. Right, and so this is strange. Like, God forgives sin, forgives transgression, forgives iniquity, yet visits the iniquity, the bentness, the crookedness of the parents on their children. And this is interesting for us to start to think about, right? Because we know that all actions have consequences. And usually when the Bible talks about punishment, or the Bible talks about, especially the Hebrew Bible talks about God punishing people, there really is no good Hebrew word for punish. The Hebrew word for punish is the word pakad, and the word pakad, it means punish, but it also just means visit. And so when you're translating the Hebrew Bible and you come across the word pakad, you don't know if it's visit or punish until you get to the stuff that happens after. So if the stuff that happens after is good, like, and the Lord visited Hannah, the mother of Samuel, like the Lord visited them, you're like, oh, the Lord pakaded, this is great, it's an awesome thing. But here, when it's by visiting the iniquity, by pakading the avon, the Lord visits the iniquity, the Lord punishes the children of the parents. And so you get this really negative connotation for visit of like, I don't want that kind of visit, that's a really not good visit. But it refers to this idea of consequences, right? God will let the consequences of people's actions come to bear, not just on them, but on their children and on their children's children. Like, what we do matters. It has an impact on the world. God is not here as like a maid to just clean up after all of our little messes, but everything that we do has some kind of impact and some kind of consequence, it's crazy for us to start to think about, right? There's a moral standard, there's a moral thing that we are set to live up to. And God says, I will pakad the avon, I will visit the iniquity of the parents upon their children and upon the children's children. But even still, even given all of this, we still have a God who decides to carry this avon for his people, right? Psalm chapter 32, talking about someone being forgiven here. Happy are those whose transgression is forgiven, whose sin is covered. Happy are those to whom the Lord imputes no iniquity, and in whose spirit there is no deceit. Moving to verse 5, then I acknowledged my sin to you, and I did not hide my iniquity. I said, I will confess my transgressions to the Lord, and you forgave the guilt of my sin. So you have a picture of this God here who actually carries the avon of my sin. He carries the iniquity. So like if I'm having to carry the consequences of the weight of the things that I've done, you can imagine God is like lifting these giant big rocks off of me and are putting them on himself. And so God carries the bentness, the crookedness, the consequences of my sin. This idea gets picked up a little bit later in the prophetic literature, and in Isaiah, you have this picture of this servant, this suffering servant who carries the avon of all, right? Again, he's bruised for our transgressions, he was wounded for our iniquities. It's that same idea. He takes all, the servant is the one who takes on all of humanity's avon, all of their iniquities, and is eventually crushed by them. But then the servant is able to take all of these things after being crushed by them, is able to do away with them, and is able to come back and is able to usher in a new way of living, and a new way of life. Which, again, we have ultimately brought about in the person of Jesus Christ. And so you have, again, this very robust picture of the human problem. It's not just sin as like a big blanket term, but it's sin is failing to miss the mark. It's sin is failing to be really and truly human, of failing to live up to that goal of honoring God and honoring people in everything that we do. But in addition to that, it's also a transgression. It's also breaking trust, which again kind of falls under that same umbrella, and it's living with the consequences of the things that we've done, the bentness and the crookedness of the way that we have made things. But the Bible is never content to just leave it there. It's never content to just say that God is like hands off and is like, you deal with your own problems. But it's a truly immanent God who comes, who lives among us, who deals with the problems of sin, of iniquity, and of transgressions, who deals with sin by crucifying it on the cross, who deals with transgressions by continuing to be trustworthy and continuing to be faithful, and takes on all of our pesha, all of our transgressions, and who ultimately lifts up our iniquity, our avon, who takes it from us, and who deals with it. And so that is the bigger, deeper, and hopefully more robust way of looking at the human condition that the Bible presents us. Are there any questions? My foot was totally falling asleep that whole time. Oh, it feels good. Stretch out. Any questions? No questions? Beautiful. Well, I hope that you take a little bit of time and you can think through some of these things because again, one of the points of thinking about sin is not just to depress ourselves and to be like, oh, we're evil, really bad people, but it's to really get us to say, there's a thing that happens with humans and it's something that's not good. So what is it, and how do we best go about approaching it and understanding it? Because as people love to say, the first part of dealing with a problem is admitting that you have a problem and then understanding what that problem is. And so I think it's important for us to understand what sin is and to understand how God has dealt with sin ultimately. Well, thanks a ton for being here with us this morning. Tune in next week. We'll have another word study and things will be good. And yeah, join us in 20, 25 minutes or so and we will engage in worship together this morning. Cool. Thank you. We'll see you.